Part 1. Origins of a New Kingdom. There are stories in America that move quietly, beneath the headlines, beneath the noise, building power not through conquest or revolution, but through devotion, identity, and unity. Stories that reshape a nation from the inside without most people ever noticing. This is the story of one of those rising powers. A people who began as outcasts, despised, hunted, and forced across a continent. A people who today command billions in assets, global influence, and a cultural identity unlike any other in the Western world. They call themselves Latter-day Saints. The world calls them the Mormons. Their story begins not in the grand halls of Washington or the crowded streets of early American cities, but in quiet forests, in rural farms, in the uncertain years after the American Revolution, when the future of a new nation was still being written. To understand the origins of the Mormon movement, we must return to the early 19th century, to a time of spiritual restlessness, revival, and chaos. The United States in the early 1800s was alive with religious fervor. Preachers traveled from town to town, setting up tents, calling crowds to repentance, promising salvation and eternal truth. This period came to be known as the Second Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical passion that swept through America's young frontier communities. Life was hard, disease was common, mortality was a constant companion. Many families searched for meaning, certainty, and hope, something permanent in a world of unpredictable change. It was in this climate that a boy named Joseph Smith Jr. came of age. He was born in 1805 in Vermont, to a family of modest means. They were religious but uncertain. They attended different churches, listened to different preachers, and found themselves unsettled by the conflicting doctrines around them. The region Joseph grew up in, Western New York, was so saturated with competing religious movements that it earned a striking name: the Burned-Over District. The idea was simple. So many revivals had swept through the area that there was no spiritual fuel left to burn. But for Joseph Smith, the spiritual fires had only just begun. Joseph Smith would later describe himself as a thoughtful, questioning young man, someone disturbed by the division he saw among Christian denominations. Why, he wondered, would God allow so many competing interpretations of His Word? Why should there be confusion, if truth was singular? According to Smith's accounts, it was at the age of 14 that he retreated into the woods near his family home, seeking clarity. There, he claimed to have experienced what would later be known as the First Vision, a revelation that would become the foundation of the Mormon faith. Smith reported that he saw a radiant light, and in that light, two divine figures, God the Father and Jesus Christ, who told him that the true Church of Christ had been lost from the earth. The world's denominations, Smith said, had strayed from original teachings. A restoration was needed, a new beginning. For believers, this moment is sacred, a divine intervention in human history. For skeptics, it is the spark of an elaborate invention, born of imagination, ambition, or desperation. The enduring power of Mormonism is found somewhere in the tension between those interpretations, between faith and skepticism, divine calling and human design. 3 years later, Joseph Smith claimed another revelation. He said that an angel named Moroni visited him, revealing the location of ancient records buried in a hillside near his home. These records, Smith said, contained the history of ancient peoples on the American continent, descendants of Israel who had crossed the ocean long before Europeans arrived. The story was extraordinary, but extraordinary stories have power, especially in unsettled times. According to Smith, the records were inscribed on golden plates, written in a language he called Reformed Egyptian. He claimed he was divinely guided to translate the text into what would become the Book of Mormon, first published in 1830. The book told of civilizations rising and falling, prophets preaching redemption, battles between warring nations, and a resurrected Jesus Christ appearing to the Americas after his crucifixion. To some, it was a holy record, revealing forgotten history. To others, it was fiction, elaborate, bold, and suspiciously timed during an era fascinated with lost tribes and ancient mysteries. Yet the book spread, and with it, followers. Early converts described Joseph Smith as charismatic, a storyteller with conviction, presence, and vision. His message was not simply spiritual, it was communal. Smith taught that God's kingdom on earth required structure, organization, unity. A people bound not just by belief, but by shared life, shared resources, and shared destiny. In a country built on individualism, this was something entirely different. It was nation-building. Small Mormon communities began forming in New York, Ohio, and eventually Missouri, where members hoped to establish what they called Zion, a holy city. But wherever the Mormons gathered, conflict soon followed. To outsiders, their unity looked threatening. Their rapid growth felt unnatural. Their loyalty to their prophet appeared suspicious and possibly subversive. And now, something even more destabilizing had entered the narrative: power. By the mid-1830s, the Mormon movement was growing quickly. They built temples, they organized banks, they purchased land and established governing structures. To many Americans, especially those living near Mormon settlements, this looked less like a church and more like a state. Newspapers began to warn of a rising religious bloc that voted together, worked together, and obeyed a single leader. Anti-Mormon sentiment grew. Local tensions escalated. Accusations of corruption, fraud, and secret teachings began circulating. Some exaggerated, others rooted in real controversies. By 1838, conflict in Missouri reached a breaking point. Violence erupted. Mormon settlements were attacked, skirmishes escalated. The governor of Missouri eventually issued what became known as the Extermination Order, declaring that Mormons must be driven from the state or exterminated. This was not a figure of speech. This was state-sanctioned religious persecution. Forced from their homes, Mormon families fled into the winter, leaving behind farms, possessions, and, in some cases, graves. This was a trauma that would shape the identity of the Mormon people for generations. Persecution, sacrifice, survival against the world. But the movement did not disappear. It reorganized. It grew stronger. And it expanded under pressure. Joseph Smith and his followers resettled in Illinois, where they founded a new city on the banks of the Mississippi River. They named it Nauvoo, a Hebrew word meaning beautiful place. Nauvoo quickly became one of the largest cities in Illinois, grander, more organized, and more unified than most American towns of its time. They built printing presses, workshops, a militia, and eventually, a magnificent temple that towered above the landscape. This was not just survival, this was transformation. Joseph Smith was no longer simply a prophet. He had become a mayor, a general, a political figure. Some followers began referring to him as a leader chosen by God to prepare the world for a divine kingdom. Others outside the faith saw something far more threatening, a man gathering enough power to shape local government, influence markets, even challenge national structures. Once again, suspicion grew. And then came the most controversial moment in Mormon history, a doctrine that would fracture the movement from the inside and turn much of the outside world violently against it: the introduction of plural marriage, polygamy. So, Joseph Smith and early church leaders first introduced plural marriage in secret, claiming it as directive from God, restoring an ancient biblical practice. But secrecy bred rumor bred outrage. Religious opponents, newspaper editors, and political leaders seized on the issue as a weapon. Inside the Mormon community, the practice caused confusion, division, and emotional turmoil. Yet for many, obedience outweighed discomfort. The community remained unified around the belief in divine instruction, even when that instruction defied cultural norms. Outside the community, however, the reaction was explosive. By 1844, Joseph Smith's power, teachings, and the shadow of polygamy had created an environment of intense hostility. Anti-Mormon coalitions formed. Local authorities issued arrest warrants. Tensions escalated to violence. Joseph Smith was eventually imprisoned in Carthage, Illinois. On June 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail and killed him, firing through the door and attacking with brutal force. The prophet of the Mormon movement died at the age of 38, but his death did not break the church. It cemented its identity. Persecution was no longer a chapter of their story. It was the story. And soon, under new leadership, the Mormons would undertake one of the most ambitious migrations in American history, crossing a continent to build a new world in the West. Part 2. Exodus to the Desert and the Rise of Zion. Joseph Smith's death left the Mormon movement shattered emotionally, but not directionless. The crisis that followed was not only political, but spiritual. Who would lead now? Who held the authority to carry forward the scriptures, the revelations, the community, and the identity the movement had fought to protect? Among the highest-ranking leaders of the church was a man whose presence would shape the trajectory of Mormonism for generations to come. His name was Brigham Young, a builder, a strategist, and a leader with an unshakable sense of purpose. Where Joseph Smith had been a visionary, Brigham Young was a commander, practical, resilient, and determined. He understood something critical. Survival required not just faith, but distance. The hostility surrounding the Mormon community in Illinois was escalating rapidly. Nauvoo, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. Newspapers called for the eradication of the Mormon presence. Politicians condemned them. Violence simmered just below the surface. Young proposed a solution bold enough to shock even his own followers. The Mormons would leave the United States entirely. They would cross the American frontier into territory not yet controlled by any state power, and build a new Zion in the vast, uncharted lands of the West. It was a monumental undertaking. Thousands of families, wagons, livestock, tools, scriptures, their own printing press. This was not simply migration, it was exodus. The journey would stretch more than 1,300 miles across plains, rivers, mountains, and unforgiving wilderness. And the travelers were not seasoned pioneers. Many were urban craftsmen, scholars, farmers, mothers with infants, elderly converts, new believers with fragile faith, and young children barely old enough to walk the trails. Yet they marched. In February of 1846, in the freezing wind of an Illinois winter, the first Mormon wagons rolled out of Nauvoo. Women wrapped children in blankets. Men pulled carts through mud thick as clay. Snow fell. Food was scarce. Disease spread. The weak faltered. Many did not survive. But the movement continued, driven by the memory of persecution, by the promise of destiny, and by the belief that God had chosen this people for a purpose greater than any they yet understood. Hundreds of miles into the journey, the landscape changed into an endless expanse of prairie and sky. To many, it must have seemed like they were leaving the world itself behind, stepping into a new chapter of history, unwritten and uncertain. Along the way, relationships with native tribes were complex and varied. Some tribes offered assistance, trade, and guidance. Others viewed the growing migration as a threat. Brigham Young, skilled in negotiation, sought alliances when possible. Survival depended on diplomacy as much as on faith. At last, after months of hardship, the Rocky Mountains rose in the distance, and beyond them lay a vast valley, dry, isolated, and silent. It was here that Brigham Young declared the journey complete. "We have found Zion," he said. The valley that would become Salt Lake City was harsh. The soil was alkaline, water was scarce, winters were brutal. But to the Mormon pioneers, isolation was not a danger. It was security. They began building immediately. Canals were dug by hand. Irrigation systems were engineered with remarkable precision. Land was allotted not based on wealth, but on need. The community moved as one, building homes, constructing mills, and laying out a city with a wide, organized grid that symbolized order and purpose. The centerpiece of this new world would be the Salt Lake Temple, a monumental structure carved from granite hauled from distant quarries. It would take 40 years to complete, a testament to patience, devotion, and continuity of identity. The temple was not merely a building, it was the heart of the Mormon cosmos, the place where heaven touched earth, where families were sealed for eternity, and where sacred rites tied the living to the dead. Surrounding the temple rose a city unlike any other in the American West. It was governed not by mayors or governors, but by church leadership. Religion, law, survival, and community were fused into a single structure. This was not just a settlement. This was a theocratic society, a nation within a nation. And in many ways, this was the moment when Mormonism transformed from a persecuted church into a quiet empire. News of the Mormon colony spread slowly across the expanding United States. To many Americans, the settlement in the desert represented something formidable and unsettling, a self-sustaining, tightly organized religious community operating independently of U.S. authority. And this independence did not go unnoticed. When the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, the territory that included Salt Lake and the surrounding region was ceded to the United States. Overnight, the Mormon kingdom was once again within the borders of the nation they had fled. The U.S. government faced a perplexing reality. An organized, rapidly growing community with its own militia, courts, and leadership, guided not by Congress, but by prophetic revelation. Conflict was inevitable. Tensions rose, especially around the issue of polygamy. In 1852, the church publicly acknowledged the practice for the first time after years of secrecy. The announcement shocked the country. For much of American society, marriage was the foundation of moral order. To many, plural marriage was not simply unusual, it was seen as immoral, archaic, even dangerous. National newspapers erupted with outrage. Politicians denounced Mormonism as a threat to civilization. Religious leaders framed the movement as a distortion of Christianity. Over the next decades, Congress would pass multiple laws aimed directly at the Mormon community, criminalizing polygamy, seizing church property, stripping Mormon men of voting rights, and attempting to dismantle the church's political power. This conflict came to define the identity of the Mormons as a people under siege, a community held together not by tradition alone, but by shared resistance to outside control. Yet, even under pressure, the Mormon Empire continued to expand. Settlers were sent throughout the American West, founding towns in Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of California. The church organized missionary efforts abroad, reaching into Europe, South America, and eventually across the globe. Wherever Mormons settled, they brought with them a distinct social model. Work hard, build community, store resources, educate children, obey leadership, endure. This model proved incredibly resilient. During droughts, they rationed. During economic downturns, they pooled funds. During political crackdowns, they retreated inward, but did not fracture. Their unity became their strength. Their discipline became their identity. Their faith became their fortress. And while the United States attempted to suppress or dismantle Mormon influence, something unexpected happened. The nation began to change. As railroads expanded and the frontier era came to a close, the government realized that Utah, with its growing population, infrastructure, and strategic location, could not be ignored. Compromise became necessary. In 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued what is known as the Manifesto, officially ending the practice of plural marriage in the church. Though complex in implementation and deeply emotional for many families, the decision opened the pathway for Utah to join the Union as an American state. In 1896, Utah became the 45th state of the United States. The struggle for survival had ended. The era of quiet expansion was about to begin. 20th century would bring a transformation far more subtle and in many ways more powerful than anything the Mormons had faced before. They shifted from pioneers to professionals, from isolated settlements to global influence. They built universities. They formed business networks. They developed some of the most advanced genealogical research systems in the world. They cultivated clean, orderly, disciplined communities. And they began shaping public perception. A new image of Mormonism emerged, one defined not by polygamy or persecution, but by family, stability, morality, and trustworthiness. Missionaries in clean white shirts and black name tags became symbols of the faith. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir became a cultural ambassador. The church's welfare programs became models of self-reliance and disaster relief. The world saw kindness, order, wholesomeness, and purpose. But beneath the calm surface, the structure of the Mormon Empire remained: a unified population, a closely directed culture, a powerful financial system, a global missionary network, an identity centered on eternity, community, and survival. The story was evolving, but the foundation remained the same. And in time, the church would become one of the wealthiest and most influential religious institutions in modern history. Part 3: Power, Wealth, and the Modern Empire. The Mormon story entered the 20th century with a new identity. No longer fugitives crossing wilderness, no longer a frontier theocracy besieged by violence, but citizens of a growing nation. They had secured a home. They had survived the storms. And now, they would turn their focus to building influence, prosperity, and stability. This next phase of their history would be quiet, deliberate, strategic, and astonishingly successful. The world changed rapidly during the 1900s. Wars reshaped borders. Markets collapsed and rose again. Nations realigned. Societies questioned faith, identity, and tradition. But through every upheaval, the Latter-day Saints remained steady. Their worldview was anchored in continuity, discipline, and the long arc of eternal time. Where many institutions planned for decades, the church planned for centuries. And it is here that the Mormon story becomes something more than religious history. It becomes the story of a modern empire, not geographic but cultural, financial, and ideological. An empire built not through conquest, but through conviction. The modern structure of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is unique among global religions. Its headquarters in Salt Lake City functions simultaneously as a religious command center, administrative hub, financial institution, and cultural capital. The city itself reflects the values of the church: clean streets, carefully planned neighborhoods, public buildings made of granite and glass, a skyline dominated not by skyscrapers, but by the soaring spires of temples, structures meticulously designed to symbolize eternity and sacred order. These temples are not simply places of worship. They are architectural statements, physical proof of permanence. By the mid-20th century, the church was expanding rapidly. New temples began rising across the United States and eventually around the world, in Canada, Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Each temple announced the arrival of a community of believers who were devoted, organized, and committed to service and self-reliance. But it wasn't only spiritual infrastructure that grew. Economic infrastructure did as well. The church developed one of the most sophisticated welfare and humanitarian systems in the world. including food storage warehouses, farms, manufacturing plants, and disaster response centers. Their model emphasized self-sufficiency. If a member fell on hard times, the church provided food, training, and support, while encouraging the individual to work or volunteer in return. This approach didn't just help families, it built dignity, solidarity, and interdependence. A community that survives together remains together. As the decades progressed, many outsiders began to notice something striking. Members of the church were often economically successful. They tended to have strong education rates, stable family structures, high volunteerism, and cohesive communities. Sociologists took interest. Politicians took interest. Corporations took interest. The image of the Mormon became, in the eyes of much of the Western world, dependable, disciplined, trustworthy. This transformation was not accidental. The church invested heavily in education. They established universities, most notably Brigham Young University, which became one of the most influential academic institutions in the American West. Students were encouraged to excel not for personal glory, but for service to family, community, and faith. This produced a generation of professionals who carried Mormon influence into fields such as business, law, government, science, and entertainment. Quietly, steadily, the community wove itself into the fabric of national life. But beneath this growth was a deeper transformation, the accumulation of wealth. And the financial structure of the church is complex, far-reaching, and intentionally discreet. It is based on a religious commandment called tithing, the expectation that members donate 10% of their income to the church. For many believers, this is not a burden. It is a covenant, a sacred act of devotion. With millions of members worldwide, this creates a remarkable source of financial power. But the church does not operate like a typical religious charity. It invests. It acquires land, businesses, and financial assets. It manages investment funds estimated at more than $100 billion, according to public filings and major financial investigations, placing it among the wealthiest religious institutions in the world. Its holdings include extensive commercial real estate, agricultural operations spanning continents, broadcasting and media companies, financial investment firms, technology services, and retail and development ventures in major American cities. Yet the church rarely advertises its wealth. It does not boast. It does not aggressively lobby. It does not seek spectacle. Its power is exercised quietly through culture, community, education, and continuity. This subtlety is what makes it so effective. Influence that does not announce itself is influence that is difficult to resist. But no power grows without scrutiny. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, public debates resurfaced surrounding issues the church has long wrestled with, including gender roles, sexuality, race, historical narratives, and past doctrines such as plural marriage. For much of its history, church leadership taught that its doctrines were unchanging, eternal. But modern society moves faster than eternity allows. Social values shift, public expectations evolve, and the church was confronted with a decision: adapt or isolate. The church chose adaptation, carefully, slowly, and strategically. Apologies were issued for past racial restrictions. Financial transparency increased in limited forms. Scholars and historians began reevaluating foundational narratives. Outreach expanded to global audiences with very different cultural identities. Yet even in adaptation, the church did not loosen its structure or core beliefs. It shifted, but it did not bend. This balance between tradition and flexibility is the reason the church has not fractured as many other religious institutions have in the modern era. But the most profound source of Mormon influence today does not come from wealth, buildings, or public image. It comes from the idea of family. In a world increasingly defined by loneliness, transience, and fragmentation, the Latter-day Saints offer something powerful, a promise of eternal belonging. Families are not simply social units. In Mormon belief, they are sacred structures that continue beyond death, sealed together forever in the afterlife. This belief has shaped one of the largest genealogical research efforts in human history. The Church operates vast archives, physical and digital, preserving records from nations around the globe. Millions of people, including non-members, have turned to Mormon databases to uncover their ancestral histories. This work is not simply historical curiosity, it is theological. In Mormon doctrine, the past, present, and future form an unbroken chain of identity. You are not an individual drifting through time. You are part of a lineage, a story, and stories endure. This, more than anything else, is what makes the Mormon empire so resilient. It is not an empire of land, but of memory. Not of borders, but of identity. Not of conquest, but of belonging. Empires built on force crumble. Empires built on belief endure. Today, the Church continues to expand globally. Temples rise in major cities across continents. Missionaries travel to remote regions. New congregations appear in places thousands of miles from Salt Lake City. Not all who encounter Mormonism join it. Not all who join remain. But the movement continues, quietly, steadily, with purpose. Some see the Church as a refuge of faith and family in a chaotic world. Others view it as an institution of immense power whose influence is underestimated. Both perspectives hold truth, because the Mormon story is not simple. It is a story of suffering and triumph, isolation and integration, unity and controversy, conviction and adaptation. It is a story still being written. And so, we return to the beginning. A boy in a forest seeking truth. A people crossing plains in the dead of winter. A city rising in the salt desert. An empire of belief spreading quietly across the earth. The Mormons are no longer a persecuted minority struggling to survive. They are architects of one of the most enduring religious movements of the modern age, whether viewed with admiration, skepticism, reverence, or caution. Their influence is undeniable. Their identity is unshaken. And their story, like the desert they claimed, continues to expand outward in all directions. End of documentary.